Hello, everyone. Welcome to our virtual presentation using the Sustainable Livelihoods framework in support of a housing-first approach to social and community integration. My name is Brian Rock. I have been employed at Family Services for approximately 4 years, and I'm in the role of Integrated Support Team Worker. That is a fancy title that we use at Family Services to say I'm a housing-first worker within our Windsor-Essex Housing Connections program. One thing I really enjoy about Family Services is the fact that they give us what's called wellness hours, which allows us to take some time for ourselves to work on our own mental health and wellness. So.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I think that's so important, especially in this line of work, right? Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Freer. I'm a manager of quality assurance and training at Family Services Windsor-Essex. I've been with the organization, we call it FSWE, for 3 years, and my portfolio includes communications, data, evaluation, policies, and training. I love being able to help FSWE articulate the benefits of our programs and contribute to increasing those benefits for the people that we support.
So during our presentation today, we are hoping that you will learn about Sustainable Livelihoods, which is a holistic, strength-based framework for participant engagement and asset building. The practice is grounded in motivational interviewing, which supports people who have experienced homelessness to identify strengths. It uses a coaching approach to inspire community participation amongst participants while integrating choice and autonomy. The framework incorporates an evaluation component to help measure outcomes of the approach. This presentation will feature a housing-first worker, such as myself, to provide practical, actionable ideas about the practice. Family Services Windsor-Essex has been the lead in our region's housing-first strategy since 2015. Building on our experience delivering person-centered supports, we structured our Housing First program to be flexible and highly responsive to individual needs. Beginning in 2019, FSWE adopted the Sustainable Livelihoods framework to provide more consistency between staff, ensuring a high quality of service throughout the program.
So now we're going to jump in with the Sustainable Livelihoods overview. I'll let you know that the slides that follow have been used with permission from Sustainable Livelihoods Canada, and we'll talk a little bit about them and our partnership with them as we go through this presentation. As Brian mentioned, Sustainable Livelihoods is a motivational interviewing informed practice. It started with international development. And about 20 years ago, it was adapted for Canadian use by evaluators in Ontario named Mary Ferguson, whose company is called Economos, and Janet Murray, whose company is called Resources for Results. They did some long-term projects with the Canadian Women's Foundation, specifically related to women's economic development, where they evaluated the projects using the Sustainable Livelihoods framework. Throughout this, they have really focused on engaging people who use the tools and people who use the services of the programs that use the tools over time. And as a result, if you look at old versions of the Sustainable Livelihoods framework, you'll see differences in wording and actually even fewer asset areas. And this is because as they've learned over the 20 years, they've improved and modified the tools. So what Sustainable Livelihoods is really based on is this idea that livelihood strategies build resilience. It acknowledges that conditions must be met before someone can build resilience and focus on the future. And we know this so clearly in our Housing First work. It provides a framework for making that shift. So in Housing First, that means moving from support to more of a coaching role. And the idea is that first, people need to meet the conditions for participation. And we know this through Housing First, that without a home, it's very challenging for someone to start thinking about the future and planning for their future goals. So making sure that people have income security, food security, safety, that all of their basic needs are met tends to be the priority when you're looking at sustainable livelihoods model. It's supporting intentional change to help people progress out of poverty. The idea is that how can we respond to poverty and climate vulnerability? How can we promote sustained participant independence, stability, and participation? Once those conditions for participation are met and a person is ready to start thinking about the future, then you start to see the capacity to participate increase. And this results in a set of skills and behaviors that promote empowerment and sustain resilience and asset building. At Family Services Windsor Essex, we already were really focused on building resilience in the people that we support across all of our programs, but in particular our Housing First program. And so as a result, this framework really seemed to align well with the work that we were already doing. We recognized that our staff were doing a really good job of supporting people through our Housing First program, but it was helpful for us from a measurement perspective, which you'll hear about later, and also from a quality assurance perspective to have this framework that helped new staff understand, what are the important pieces that you need to remember when you're working with a new client in the Housing First program, but also helped longer term staff to have some new tools in their toolbox in terms of the ways that they work with people that they support. And finally, it helps us to see the progress that someone has made throughout the program. And in our program, where we're looking at supporting people for 3 years from the beginning of the program through graduation, we really are able to now start to see when those shifts start to occur and make sure that we're able to start thinking about tapering services at the appropriate times. So sustainable livelihoods is grounded in an asset-based framework. It's holistic and strengths-based. There are 6 asset areas in the framework. And as I mentioned, one of these is actually fairly new. It's about 5 years old, and that is the health asset area. So the folks at Economos and Resources for Results, when they were looking at this, the 5 previous asset areas, they recognized that health was so integral, and that includes mental health. And so they added that as another asset area. The wonderful thing about sustainable livelihoods is that it really is intended to be person-centered, and it's intended to be program-centered as well, so that where you need to make adjustments and changes, you are able to do that. And so I'll talk to you about a change that we made at Family Services. So this is the asset map guide, and this gives you an idea of what the asset areas are. So assets are building blocks for your future. And here we take a positive, well-rounded approach to look at all of a person's strengths. The assets can be what someone knows, their lived experience, their skills and abilities, and their learning and training. And as you all know, it's so important for people to start to recognize their strengths and their assets that they have that may not be traditional assets, and that society may have told them were not assets. But we really help people to uncover those and see that the living on the streets and living rough in the way that they may have over all of this time has supported them to build some strengths, and that they can use those and transfer those into their future. So the 6 asset areas as they are today are basic needs, and those include everything from housing to safety. Information is on there, and childcare. We know those are so important. Connections, again, we know that connections are really important. Many people who are in our Housing First program have lost connections with family, and so one of our areas of focus can be to help them build those connections. Many people also may not have strong connections. They may have, connections of convenience, of folks that they have gotten to know over the years in their time experiencing homelessness. And so we can help them to identify where are those positive connections and how can they have more of those. Sense of self, of course, so important for the people that we support in terms of self-confidence, understanding their own strengths and abilities. And this is really an area where people eventually learn to focus and to be able to make sure that they are building that resilience. And I think that's where we see the key here. Skills and employability. Now, I will tell you, we ran Sustainable Livelihoods as a pilot first at Family Services across our programs, and Brian was a member of the pilot group. And we ran that pilot for 3 months before we launched it across all of our programs with all of our staff. And what we identified during that pilot, and Housing First is a key example of this, is that employment is not always the goal for people. And so we've actually changed this for our own purposes to be skills and participation. So it's helping people learn how they can participate fully in society. And that's really that connection with community and social integration, right? So looking at their lived experiences, what do they know, what can they learn, and how do they want to be involved in the community, and helping them build more of that. Again, money, of course, is a very key factor. And so making sure that people have the money available to make ends meet. One of the interesting things that we learned through Sustainable Livelihoods is that some of these areas, when you see the asset map tools, people will think that their assets are higher in an area when they do their initial asset map. And then over time of working with us, they realize that maybe they were more confident than they should have been in that area. So money is a key example of that. Someone who's been borrowing money to make ends meet may think that they're okay in their money area. And as time goes on, they realize that borrowing is not a sustainable way to make ends meet. And so they eventually realize that they may have to decrease their consideration of their asset in that area. And then the final one is health. As I mentioned, this is a newer one, but it includes stress levels, mental health, and physical health. And all of these are so important. And we see such an improvement in health, often because health systems are very challenging to navigate. And so with support, people learn how to be able to navigate those systems, which can include everything from, making the phone call to the right doctor, to advocating for yourself, to get specialist treatment if you need it, and to getting transportation to healthcare appointments, which often is a big barrier for people as well. So this slide shows the vulnerability context. And I think most of you would be familiar with this because it's the systems that we all work in. And so formal and informal systems, the way that society works, that makes it really challenging for people to move out of homelessness, to become housed, and to be successful in their housing. These are things that hold people back. It can be society, community and workplace, family, and sometimes themselves. The idea of the vulnerability context is that we're helping people to better weather the shocks that happen within the systems and trends and cycles that they experience, so that they don't get set as far back and they can develop a path forward. And that may be with or without support. So we recognize that there will always be shocks, cycles, looking at patterns connected to stages of people's lives, reproductive choices, family roles, relationships, seasonality, trends that include broader social, economic, political forces that can impact people's security, globalization, increasing low-paid part-time work, and of course, our most recent trend is the global pandemic that we are currently experiencing, that for many people would have been a large shock that would have set them back. But our goal through Sustainable Livelihoods is that we help people to have the good foundation in place so that a setback doesn't have as great of an impact as it may have in the past, and that they are able to move forward more quickly and more deliberately than they may have been in the past. So next we'll look at the livelihood stages, and we call this the slinky slide. And the reason that it's a slinky is because we recognize that this progress is not linear, and often people may take a couple of steps forward and a step or two back, and that is absolutely normal. And so we really try to help people recognize that when those shocks happen, it is expected that you will go backward, but we're trying to stop you from going all the way back to stage one. And in this case, stage one is destabilized and stabilizing. And that's often where we see people come to us in Housing First. In some of our other programs, we might be more in stage 2 or stage 3, but in Housing First, when we're really starting to make those connections with people, we see them in stage 1. That's where their assets have been depleted. They're in a cycle of crisis. Their focus is just on coping. They're just trying to get by and meet their basic needs. And so our goal is to help move them through these stages, recognizing again that it's not linear. So the next stage, stage 2, is around engaging. And so that's when people are ready to connect to community. They're ready to start making some changes. Stage 3 is on foundation building. That's where we're building that strong foundation, that base of stability. We're building some skills. We're helping still to support them. There's still that support. And then stage 4 is around transition. So here people are making progress. They're starting to change some of those patterns that in our case, where we are working with chronic and episodic, people who have experienced chronic and episodic homelessness, we really, it takes a long time to get that changing life patterns, but how impactful can that be? And Brian will talk to you a little more about that. But then stage 5 is around consolidation. And so that includes creating some economic solutions, decreasing vulnerability for folks. And then the goal is the sustainable livelihood. And that may look different for everyone. So not everyone has the same vision of what a sustainable livelihood looks like. And our work is to help people identify what that looks like for them. So a key example, as I mentioned, we use skills and participation rather than employability. And that's because we support a lot of people who are on Ontario Disability Support Program. And so with their disability, it may not be feasible that they would end up full-time employed, and they may not end up having that as their primary source of income. So what does a sustainable livelihood look like for them? And that may be getting into rent geared to income housing so that they have enough to make those ends meet. So the sustainable livelihood is about security, resilience, and ability to reduce vulnerability. And so that's where we see people who, can weather those shocks and can stay on the livelihood continuum and not go all the way back to stage 1. So at the bottom of this slide, you see the conditions for participation and capacity to participate, as we've talked about. And underneath that, you see survival mode, and that's really those coping strategies. And the folks we work with are really good at those coping strategies. But what we're trying to help them move toward is that future mode. And those are those asset building strategies. And so the gradients that are here show that different people will get to those points at different livelihood stages. So none of this is concrete and set in stone. Some folks will be ready to start thinking about the capacity to participate and thinking about the future by stage 2. Others, it may be closer to stage 4 when they get there. And sometimes, maybe more often than not, we start to have a conversation about future mode and a setback happens. And so we need to take a step back into that survival mode for a little while, and then we can come back to future mode. And that's really the beauty of a Housing First program that's designed to be long-term, because we have the time to help work with people in that way and to do the back and forth. Our goal is that as people are in survival mode, we're really providing support. But as they move into future mode, we're becoming the coaches and we're helping them to take control and to do things in a way that's going to support them moving forward in the future. So when we put it all together, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to how we measure this, but this slide shows an example of an initial asset map on the left and a follow-up map on the right. And that follow-up map details the outcomes and the change that happened over time. So we're all working within this vulnerability, policy, and institutional context. And we're just trying to help people we're designing and delivering programs that help move people through the systems as best they can. So our interventions are strategic and practical, and we're really working with people to help them increase their assets. The other important thing to know is that this is all, as I said, person-centered. So when you'll see our tools, and when a person wants to work on a certain asset, we follow their lead and we allow them to identify which assets they want to work on when, what goals they're going to set to work on those assets. And we just work with them to help make those goals manageable and ensure that they are set up for a success as well as possible.
Okay, now I'm going to take over for Allison, and I'm going to talk a little bit about using sustainable livelihoods at FSWE. So I'm going to talk about the practical application of it and how we utilize it as a tool to support our clients. So I want to tell you a little bit about Family Services Windsor-Essex and the work that we do. So we are a multi-service organization focusing on mental health, basic needs, inclusion, and community involvement. We're the lead housing first provider in Windsor-Essex since 2015. We operate from a trauma-informed care perspective. All phone calls to the agency while we are open are live answered during business hours in order to provide real-time support to clients when necessary. Some programs of note include, but are not limited to, elder abuse support, hoarding response program to provide clinically based supports to people experiencing hoarding disorder, the voluntary trusteeship program to address finance issues with clients, community counseling with no wait and no turn away without ability to pay. Employee assistance programs we offer as well, which is a social enterprise to support other programs and Housing First program through the partnership with Windsor Essex Housing Connections. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our intake and engagement process. So at Family Services, integrated support team workers receive client referrals to the Housing First program through the by names prioritized list and from our outreach workers who identify those individuals who are most in need of immediate supports. Engagement is done in the community with the support of outreach staff, shelters, our H4 hub, and other community agencies. The focus is initially placed on introducing the Housing First program and developing a positive rapport and trusting relationship with our participants. Once that relationship is established, we work to resolve any immediate barriers that may exist to finding housing, such as income, ID, and completing their central housing registry application for rent geared to income housing. Once these initial things are taken care of, that is when we start to introduce the sustainable livelihoods with our clients. The concepts of the sustainable livelihoods approach are best introduced when attempting to identify the goal areas that we want to work on with our clients. The client is assisted with completing an asset map, which provides a visual cue of strength areas in the client's life and provides an opportunity to highlight where skills can be increased and improved. This is a blank copy of what our asset map looks like. A little later on, I'm going to show you a real life example of what an asset map looks like. The Sustainable Livelihoods framework can be less triggering and allows a softer approach when we discuss traumatic events in the client's past. This framework also allows the client to be in control of identifying areas of concerns since the asset map is completed by them. When we talk about goal setting and accountability, this framework allows the client to self-identify the areas in their life that may need improvement. This can allow the client to decide on what goals are most important to them at any given time. When updating the asset maps, it will provide insight for the client on improvements made and where there is opportunity for continued improvement. So like Allison mentioned before, sometimes when we complete an initial asset map, the client's views of where their strengths are and where there's an opportunity for improvement may change over time. They may realize that, you know, maybe they thought their asset was a bit stronger in one area when actually there's an opportunity to improve that area. So when completing goal reviews, in addition to the sustainable livelihood updates, it allows for feedback on what may be working and if goals need to be adjusted based on client self-reporting. So there are some challenges to using the sustainable livelihoods model, and I will discuss a couple of them now. As we all know, as Housing First workers, many of our clients are not really comfortable with filling out forms and many times do not have the patience or ability to sit through additional meetings completing more paperwork. Sometimes the client does not want to rate themselves on a scale of any kind. They can have trouble identifying where limitations exist in their lives. So depending on the demeanor and focus of the client, sustainable livelihood mapping may need to be divided into more than one meeting to be completed. Asset maps may need to be completed by the staff and presented to the client for their thoughts and consideration based on self-reporting. So by using some of the information that we gather, we can actually complete the sustainable livelihood map for the client and present it to them as a visual of what we've been talking about. So they don't necessarily have to fill out the map. We can do that for them and then show them, you know, by what you're saying, this is what we're seeing as far as what your strengths are. Staff need to be aware of possible triggering of past trauma for the client, much like when we do SPIT-ATs. right? So when we do talk about connections, when we do talk about their basic needs, you know, many times that can bring up some sensitive areas for our participants, but this allows us to give the opportunity to dive a little deeper into those areas and talk about how we might be able to fix those. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how sustainable livelihoods has changed our practice and approach at family services. Like many new things, when it was first introduced, staff were not keen on having to do more paperwork and assessments. But once embraced and utilized, it can become and has become the main tool where we draw all our information from regarding service plan reviews, goal reviews, etc. It is a great snapshot of a client at any given time. So it does allow us to, if we use the sustainable livelihoods as a main focus when we're dealing with the clients, it allows us to look at that map and see the current areas where improvement needs to be made and where focus should be centered. The sustainable livelihood framework allows the client to take control and be accountable of the progress being made while receiving support from the program. The client is the person who identifies and decides on the goal areas to be focused on based on the self-reporting and completion of the asset map. The client can visually compare the progress being made in each area of their life and have concrete understanding of what is needed to improve the different areas included in the asset map. Presenting the change and progress using stages support the implementation of specific SMART goal setting to increase the likelihood of success. So how does sustainable livelihoods align with the Housing First principles? So the first principle, as we all know, is immediate access to permanent housing. So meeting basic needs, getting out of crisis mode, building the conditions for participation. Using asset maps can help the client identify if there are current supports available that are not being utilized at this time. So it can help them identify family, friends, community agencies or supports that may be available to help them access permanent housing. Consumer choice and self-determination. So sustainable livelihoods is client-led, it's motivational interview informed, and it's responsive to the person's needs and individual choices. Information gathered for the asset maps is self-reported and provides a visual picture for the client to review and then decide the goal areas to focus on. For recovery orientation, sustainable livelihoods is a holistic, strengths-based approach. It's focused on connections and participation. The health asset area is relevant to addictions and mental health. It allows the client to see where there may be gaps in supports being utilized at any one time. It provides an opportunity for the client to self-identify where more supports could be accessed and where to focus energy and decision-making. For individualized and client-driven supports, it's individualized service, voluntary, and portable. It's culturally appropriate, and it's building conditions for participation and shifting to capacity to participate. It increases resiliency and identifies areas where the individual can grow their assets and strengths. Social and community integration. Sustainable livelihoods help people with building connections, building their sense of self, and participation in the community. It shifts from being the primary, it helps us shift from being the primary support to being one of many sources of support, moving at the right pace for the individual.
Now I'll get started about some of the results at Family Services Windsor Essex. As Brian just mentioned, shifting from being the only source of support to moving at the right pace of the individual having multiple sources of support is really part of the key. And that's helping to unlock, when you looked at the My Plan slide, it's helping to unlock when someone can do something for themselves. So we're asking them to identify, can I do this by myself? And then we're asking them to say how confident they feel in doing that by themselves. And that gives you a piece of accountability that is really powerful to be able to come back at the next meeting. Our service standard is to meet with people once a week throughout the beginning of the program at least. And so to be able to come back a week later and say, hey, you were going to make this phone call and you didn't, you were feeling pretty confident about it. What happened? And so then that's really changing that relationship into coaching. And you start to see that in our results. So Sustainable Livelihoods generally focuses on the participant doing their own asset map. And we think that's very important, but it's also a little bit hard to measure. And so we've tried to create some other tools for staff to help make this a little bit more measurable from our perspective. So one of those things is an asset map for discussion with participants. And so this tool helps staff to bring it forward with participants and has lists of what different assets could be in each of the asset areas. It gives a little bit more information about how we use the asset map, that it helps to set priorities for our work together, think about progress over time. It helps people know that there are no right or wrong answers and that some assets may become stronger while others may become less strong, and that's all okay. We let them know that we pull all of our asset maps together and that we do this anonymously to look at change over time across the program. This helps us to learn and improve as we go and to be able to tell the story of our programs. Now, we also really focus on making sure that we're engaging staff in order to be able to understand how this is working, any tweaks that we need to make over time, and whether there are things that are just really not working that we completely need to change or look at. So we let people know that no one but you and your FSWE staff member will know which asset map is yours. We think it's really important to make sure that people understand confidentiality because this is their personal information and we want them to feel comfortable providing that and having these conversations with staff. So this is the tool we've created to help staff be a little bit more objective in terms of the asset map. So they complete the asset map, and Brian has mentioned a couple of different ways where staff complete the asset map with a participant. We've also heard from some of our staff who work directly with youth that often it's in a car ride, they're saying, hey, how do you feel about your connections these days? And kind of doing things a little bit more that way. There are folks, as Brian mentioned, who really would feel challenged to do all of the asset map all in one day. And so it can be spread out over a couple or a few meetings. I also want to recognize that where we look at our engagement strategy, we say within 2 to 3 meetings that we introduce the asset maps. But again, that's really client-led. And so if it's not the right time, if they're really still in that survival mode, then we may wait longer to introduce the asset maps. We then do follow-up asset maps every 3 months. And once again, this is client-led. And so if someone has just gone right back into a crisis, then we may wait a little bit longer to do a follow-up asset map, where at the same time, depending on the client, they may find that a really helpful tool to do the asset map and reflect on their strengths, even in that crisis mode, to start to think about how they can move forward. So we really rely on the skill and expertise of our staff to help make these decisions about when to introduce these conversations with clients. But in terms of the staff reflection, we ask people to complete a chart after they've worked with someone to go through an asset map, whether that be in one meeting or a few meetings. And they use their participants' assessment, but they also layer their own knowledge about that participant and other participants. And so what we've created here is a matrix that would help to be able to, like I said, be a little bit more objective about the results of the asset map. So what you see on the left column of this table is all of the asset areas. And then at the top, you see the livelihood stages. And so we've tried to define what that asset area might look like in each livelihood stage. Again, recognizing that it may be slightly different for different people. We tried to capture as much as possible. And we do update this over time as we learn more or as our staff get more comfortable with using it. But we asked them to take a look for each participant at this matrix. And then we've created a tool And this is just an Excel tool that we use we use a database called EMHware. And so people list their participant ID. We're trying to maintain privacy as much as possible. They have the different instances of the asset maps that they've created. And they just list the date that they did the asset map, and they list the number of which livelihood stage that they're in under that area. And then they can leave comments as well. And so here you can see the initial asset map and the second asset map. And we have subsequent rows to be able to show future asset maps as well. So what we can do now is each staff completes one of these Excel spreadsheets and sends them to us monthly, recognizing that, that the asset maps are generally done every 3 months. So we'll have a few in each of these monthly, and then we roll them all up together for all of our staff. And remember, we're using sustainable livelihoods actually across our organization, so in a variety of different programs, but this allows us to be able to look at the Housing First program specifically, but also to be able to look at our impact across the different programs that we offer. So this is what you can see when we've completed these asset maps. And so these are some of our other programs. So we have an adult protective service worker program, which supports people who have developmental disabilities. And so you can see what change over time looks like in these asset areas. We also have a voluntary trusteeship program where we support people with financial needs and financial literacy. And so you can see that inside and on both of these, it's the blue radial on the inside shows the initial asset map, and this is the average across all of the participants in each of these programs. And then the outside on both of these is the green, and so you can see where there's been really some big change over time. And it's interesting to see how things change, and some areas that see significant amount of change, and some areas that see less change. And again, that's really client-led and what they wanted to work on. So there's a couple more examples here around our client intervention program. And as Brian mentioned, that's around our elder abuse support and our hoarding intervention. And then our child and youth worker program, which is an element of our housing programs, specifically dealing with youth. And so you can see some change over time in these as well. You'll see that some programs were able to get 4 asset maps in, and some programs were able to get 3 asset maps in. This is for the 2020-2021 fiscal year. And so we do one of these reports at the end of each year where we're able to look at our results. And it's a really great way to see what change is happening in our programs. We find it also to be very motivating for staff to be able to look and actually see the change that's happening across the program, because they have an idea of what's happening with each individual participant, but this gives them an example of what's happening throughout the program, and we can do them for individual staff across their own portfolio as well. When we get to our results for our Housing First program, you see there hasn't been as much change in the asset areas. You can see that some of our staff got up to a 5th asset map, and that's because some were involved in the pilot, so they were really on the ground from day one delivering these asset maps. And so you can see on initial maps, 57 participants within our programs had completed initial asset maps, and 50 had completed a second asset map. And so we really do see a high uptake within these programs. Our goal is that about 60% of participants across the organization are taking part in or involved in the Sustainable Livelihoods framework. And within our Housing First program, it's much higher. It's above 85% of people are actually participating. So our staff clearly find these tools to be useful. We know the complexity of people we support through our Housing First program means that things will take more time. And so we're really looking forward to over, the 3 years that someone may be engaged with the Housing First program, that we will see these asset areas increase even more. Because as you can see here, in 1 year, some of these decreased. And we also have to, of course, remember the context, which was that we are in a global pandemic. And so that's been an exceptional challenge for people either who do not have housing or who have become recently housed, where we know that isolation can be a really big factor, pandemic aside. And so now knowing that people have been asked to, be on lockdown or to isolate, we would anticipate that we wouldn't see as great of changes within these asset areas. We've also heard things from staff about lack of access to technology or even to phones, and then that affects their access to healthcare potentially. People who didn't have health cards and so became really challenged to access healthcare in general because they didn't have or had lost their health cards. So We expected to see this at the end of this fiscal year, but we're really hopeful that by the end of the next fiscal year, we'll start to see some greater movement within these asset areas in the Housing First program. So the one area that we did see some change was around skills and participation, and that's really important that we saw some positive change, and that's really important, you know, recognizing that people are able to start to think about what their skills are that they'd like to develop, either to focus on employability in the future or just to focus on more participation in terms of community and social integration in the future. So stay tuned for more results around our Housing First program and the Sustainable Livelihoods framework. But I will also show you one way that we've used to describe our work in sustainable livelihoods. And so this is our 2020-2021 impact. So we've identified an output in each of the areas, or an outcome in each of the asset areas. And we've created this tool to help talk about the work that we've done in the areas. And specifically under basic needs, we're really proud that we were able to house 60 people experiencing homelessness into permanent housing. And this was an agency record for us over 2021. So that was something that we were very proud of in a pandemic. And in Windsor, Essex, we're also experiencing a very tight housing market, as many communities are. And so it's definitely a challenge, and it's a testament to our staff that they were able to move 60 people into permanent housing over the last year. So now I think I'll turn it over to Brian, and he'll talk about a real life example.
Thanks, Allison. So I'm going to cover an initial asset map that I did with a participant of mine, and then we're going to review quickly the most recent asset map that's been completed with him. So we're going to call this participant Mr. K. This participant had been recently housed before we introduced Sustainable Livelihood. So I had been working with him for a little bit of time before we introduced this, and we were able to find him housing before we started this asset mapping. So at the time, we pretty much just had a basic goal in place with him, and his focus was on staying housed and maintaining his tenancy. Right, that was all he really wanted to focus on. He had a new place, he wanted to keep it. So when we did introduce the asset mapping and started talking about you know, different areas of his life in more specific terms, he was able to identify things such as in basic needs. Right, he was able to identify, I have housing, I have income. Many people would say his basic needs are met. But when we talked a bit further about it, using the staff reflection sheet and the other tools we have, he was able to identify, you know, I don't have a lot of furniture. I don't have internet. I don't have a phone, right? I don't have cable or regular TV. So he was able to say that these things are important to me in order to keep my tenancy maintained and be happy with it. So what we did is we started to develop a plan. And his plan was, he wanted to focus, obviously, like he said, keeping his housing, but what that meant to him was saving to improve his apartment by buying more items and making it feel more like a home. So I'm going to just focus on that basic needs aspect because we're running short on time. So this is what we came up with. His to-do list was he wanted to budget better, and he also wanted to focus on his recovery. So in order to budget better, he agreed that maybe it was important that he write down an actual budget and try to follow that. Right. And his other goal area, he said, was he wanted to stay sober. Right. So one of his plans that he developed as well was to stop hanging around our downtown Mission area so much, because he was able to identify that that was an area of concern that invited some possible issues for him moving forward. Okay, so we'll fast forward to the most recent asset map that's been completed. And so the first asset map was done in April of 2020. this asset map was completed in September of this year, so approximately, a month ago or so. As you can see, many of his areas have improved. He's been able to identify that he now has a nice apartment. He's been there long term. He now has a phone, he has internet, he has cable, and he has, he's furnished his place so that he's quite happy with it, and it, he considers it his home. So this was done over time by looking at small specific things that he could focus on to set as goals, right? So over time, his goals did change, but it was based on what we wrote down in the asset maps. So currently what his plan is, he is looking to gain employment within the community. He figures right now, he thinks things are pretty good, and his focus is to find a job, right? That's important to him at this point in time. So his current plan was to finish his resume and start applying to jobs. We identified that community supports could include job placement agencies and people to help him develop his resume, right? So also part of the asset map is to identify things that might make it difficult to move forward, right? So he identified that obviously the pandemic we're in has been an issue, right? And as well, he agreed that he has to motivate himself to apply for those jobs in order to get one, right? So that is kind of a quick rundown of how we use asset maps with our clients to help them develop specific goals that they can work on. And I will say this client was pretty much ready to graduate. He feels he's in a good spot, but due to the pandemic, he requested that we stay on to support him until things calm down a little bit. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about what staff actually think about using sustainable livelihoods. Staff find the asset map tool and the reflection discussion sheets to be very helpful in trying to identify specific goals that can be implemented to improve in a client's life. The information collected using the Sustainable Livelihood Framework assists us with being able to bring specific issues to the team for discussion. So it helps us highlight what areas we can get additional community supports for. And it allows staff to identify where specific referrals could be made to increase support for the client.
Thanks, Brian. So this is nearing the conclusion of our program. We'll tell you a little bit about what Family Services plans moving forward in terms of sustainable livelihoods. We're currently, as I mentioned, we engage staff as much as possible to learn about how they're using the tools and how the tools are working and get their perspective on what clients think of the tools. But we're beginning a process of deeper engagement with the people that we support to learn more about their experience with the framework and what they think about it. We're also planning to bring in more training with Sustainable Livelihoods Canada. And that's a great way to get even deeper into learning about sustainable livelihoods. They have a multi-day training that they offer, which includes motivational interviewing certification. And so if you are interested in using sustainable livelihoods in your practice, it would be a great idea to contact Sustainable Livelihoods Canada. They're at www.slcanada.org. And Janet and Mary are wonderful folks who would be happy to talk to you and help you problem solve about how this can be implemented at your organization and in your Housing First practice. We'll now open it up for questions live, but if you need to reach us, our contact information is here on the slide. So thank you very much for listening.